because women are overburdened with responsibilities of care, they're less likely to become entrepreneurs. And then when women become financially vulnerable as a result of the fact that they do not have employment, they're more vulnerable to abuse in the home, because interpartner violence is the most prevalent kind of violence, not only in South Africa, but almost everywhere in the world. So financially vulnerable women are going to be more vulnerable to abuse within the home in particular. So we don't just do the work for the sake of it. I don't just do Women 20 for the sake of it. I do it because it matters, it not only to me, but I think it matters generally. And so that's why I do what I do.
I think that's one of the key issues in a democracy, is not like through the institutions, but having the culture inform the newer generations about what you should look out for in an institution, how to know if they're going wrong, and how you can affect them, right? Because I imagine one big thing for you is, how do people interact with these institutions? Can they affect it?
Certainly, creating a warm and engaging introduction for your podcast, consider Great Tell Me as a suggestion that combines an upbeat and inviting spirit without any background music. Welcome to Tangelic Talks, your go-to podcast from Tangelic, where we dive into the vibrant world of clean energy, development, sustainability, and climate change in Africa. We bring you inspiring stories, insightful discussions, and groundbreaking innovations from the continent making waves in the global community. Tune in and join the conversation toward a brighter, greener future. Let's get started.
Welcome to Tangelic Talks, a podcast at the intersection of energy, equity, and empowerment with your co-hosts Victoria Cornelio and Andres Tamez. In today's episode, our guest is Professor Narnia Bohler-Muller, a powerhouse in law, governance, and social justice. She's a Divisional Executive for the Development, Capable, and Ethical State of South Africa's Human Sciences Research Council, an admitted advocate of the High Court, and has represented the country on global stages like Women 20, BRICS or BRICS, and the Indian Ocean Rim Association. Welcome, Professor Narnia. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you and to be able to share some interesting information.
Amazing.
Hopefully.
Well, we really wanted to talk to Professor Narnia because she's been involved in a lot of strong institutions. And I'm a believer that when we say things so generally as a strong institution, we're using it as a placeholder. So she's going to help us unpack that a little bit, what it looks like, what it means, what is included in a strong institution. But before we get into that, how did you come into this world?
That's a good question. Well, a long time ago, I started studying law, and I wanted to become a journalist. Let me start there, because I was very interested in politics and political science and what was happening in South Africa at that stage, which was really overcoming the years of apartheid. So it was something I really wanted to do. My father said, over my dead body, you're not going to be a journalist. You won't make enough money. And he got me going to study law. So that's where it all started. Everything came from a legal perspective. And as I moved on with my law degrees into my doctorate of law, LLD, I started focusing more on the philosophy of things and law itself, what the origins of law are, what the law means, what it doesn't mean, what the limitations of the law are. And that kind of brings you into the whole issue of institutions, as you were saying, as a placeholder, because the law itself is a kind of an institution. So from there, I became more involved in and interested in doing research as, providing evidence to policymakers, basically, to make sure that we are going to be adopting sound policies for people on the ground. And that can only really be done, in my view, through research. And I went into the research side of things, away from teaching law per se, and ended up at the Human Sciences Research Council, where we do exactly what I'm interested in doing, the interface that I'm working at now, where we're actually able to present evidence to decision makers around the kinds of laws and policies that they're interested in adopting. They need not listen to us, but we do it anyway. And we do that at numerous different levels. So, of course, nationally, we work with our national government and the state in general, more generally. And I also work in the international space, as you've mentioned, with, at the moment, Women 20. I'm the head of delegation of Women 20 for South Africa under South Africa's presidency. But in the past, also BRICS and the Indian Ocean Rim Association. Very interesting multilateral spaces.
That is so cool. And your career has bridged academia, law, governance, international diplomacy. There's so many rooms and institutions that you've been a part of. So what would you say is a guiding principle that has shaped your journey? How have you moved through these spaces?
I think a belief in ethics and integrity in everything that I do. So whichever area I'm working in and whichever institution I'm at, there are certain principles that I carry with me, and really around fairness, objectivity, justice, transparency, accountability, all of the things that I believe are necessary for good governance. And so that's really what I carry. The whole issue of human rights is really central to what I do, and it does shape almost everything that I do. I try to bring it into the spaces that I'm in. It's not necessarily something that shapes institutions, but I think should shape institutions. Issues of human rights and social justice, and of course, robust democracy.
I agree. And what do you mean when you say ethical practices? So what does ethics look like, for example, in your role at the Human Sciences Research Council?
Well, I mean, there's different kinds of ethics. So we follow very strong research ethics protocols. We have we have an ethics board, and everything that we do goes through the ethics board, and they say, okay, everything's in line and you can proceed with whatever research that you do. So there's that, but there's also a way of living your life, I think. And that's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about ethical or normative or value-based contributions to wherever you are and whatever you are doing. So as I've mentioned, I think it's just a way of living your life that doesn't harm others, I think. Very important, that doesn't cause harm, but also where you try to help as much as possible, to shed light on issues, to use whatever talents you have for the betterment of public good. I mean, Human Sciences Research Council's motto is social science that makes a difference. And so we don't just do the work for the sake of it. I don't just do Women 20 for the sake of it. I do it because it matters, it not only to me, but I think it matters generally. And so that's why I do what I do.
I love that. And I think that's really important because a lot of people, there is something there about the debate between, are we just selfish doing good, or are we doing good and that makes us feel good, right? Do you think ethics are, what's the word, like natural or intrinsic to humans? Is it something that we can debate when something is ethical? What's the guideline?
I think it's very debatable. I really do. It's not necessarily morality in your traditional sense of the word. So it's not necessarily about religion even. Look, I'm not sure if people are ethical by nature or not. It's difficult to tell in the world that we're living in today. But I think that hopefully people do embrace a certain kind of care, I guess. In my feminist work, I talk a lot about the ethic of care. So in that sense, it's not only about your sense of justice, but your sense of responsibility towards others and towards the planet. So it's something that I guess comes from within you, yes, but it is also instilled. It's also structural and systemic in nature, how you brought up, the kind of communities that you belong to, the kind of society you want. So I think in South Africa, it's very unique because, we went through this transition to democracy, and we really kind of started understanding the importance of equality, of values, dignity, the way that you treat and respect other people. So it became a kind of, a way of life for many of us, although not for all of us, I must admit.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then that takes us into ethics within an institution, right? You talked about the Research Council having a strong set of guidelines of what makes ethical research, but can we assume institutions like this are ethical because they have a good guideline, or is it the people that make them strong institutions?
It's definitely the people that make them strong institutions. I think I've lived long enough and been in enough institutions to be able to say that. I mean, I'm just thinking about the kinds of situations that we're coming across in South Africa at the moment around corruption. So you could be in an institution that's really strong, like our Auditor General or our Office of the Public Protector. The institution is solid. It's a constitutionally grounded institution. But if people come into it wanting to take advantage, wanting to benefit from it for their own purposes, then that institution is weakened. And that's happened a lot in South Africa. Fortunately, our institutions are strong enough to survive that kind of thing, but it does create a massive risk. So it is about the people. It's not about the institutions themselves. And some people have tried to collapse institutions and haven't managed to do so. And others have collapsed institutions, and those institutions are still recovering.
You made this point about strong institutions, right? And is there a difference between an institution that's strong because it has like the institutions you mentioned, because they have enforcement, they're backed by the government, they're backed by a constitutional framework, right? And where do you separate the strength from being overbearing? Is there a line that can be crossed where it's not serving? This institution is strong, but it's not serving. I think that's a good way of putting it.
It is a good way of putting it, and again, it's not a black and white issue. There are grey areas with almost everything that we speak about. I think that democracy is a strong institution in and of itself. So it's not only about the constitution, but it's about the kind of constitution that you're working with, and therefore the kind of institutions that arise from that constitution that is underlined by values, dignity.
So the foundational,
yes. So, and these institutions need to be vibrant. They need to fulfill a specific kind of democratic duty towards the people. So you can see there that it's not an authoritarian type of institution that we're talking about. It's something that's supposed to be rooted in the common good. It's supposed to be rooted in a concept of respect for human rights and respect for freedom and dignity. So it's not only about doing things for the sake of it or doing things to regulate, but rather doing things for a particular purpose. And so that purpose would then determine whether you're serving the people, whether in my mind you are a strong institution, or you belong to an institution that is merely there to serve the interests of the powerful.
And how do we break down an institution? What is an institution? I think that's important to clarify, because we've said democracy is one and this other one. So where does the scale come in when we talk about an institution?
I think that, different people use different language depending on the discipline that you're coming from. So I'm guessing what we're talking about here is institutions of governance. So when I speak about the institution of democracy, that's not necessarily what we're talking about right now. I think that we're talking more about rigid and fluid spaces that work towards principles of good governance or, state building, for instance. So those kinds of institutions would be multiple. I mean, you get private institutions that are profit, seeking. You get government institutions that are also profit seeking in a sense. We have state-owned enterprises. So they're everywhere, and they're really systems that determine the functioning of your society. And that could be from your local level, grassroots level, to your cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, all the way to the president's office.
Okay. And then there's a conversation about governance there and ethical governance when it comes to these institutions. Are there any practical steps or guidelines that we can see, or someone who wants to break into this space, that they should be looking out for so they can survey if they're entering an institution that is grounded in these ethical practices?
I think, they're the king principles of good governance that exist. And I think that's a very good guideline when it comes to the way in which institutions should be governed. And it's around, how boards are established, for instance. I mean, this is an area where a lot of corruption happens and there's a lot of greed. So you have to see how the boards of those organizations, those institutions are constituted. And you need to look at
would these be the sort of part of the institution that's vulnerable to be lobbied to or to be manipulated by an external
absolutely.
Board? Okay.
If I can give an example of my own institution. So we are what we call in South Africa an organ of state. So we are perceived in some instances as serving government's interests. However, we have an independent board, and that board's independence is protected. So through rules, regulations, conventions, whatever the case may be, they need to be there to establish the independence of that group of people who are responsible for the governance of the organization, and then the independence of the organization itself towards the board. So I think that it is important to have structures in place for something like this, because otherwise it does become vulnerable to manipulation, not only political manipulation, but in manipulation by private interests as well. So when we had the Zondo Commission, Anti-Corruption Commission in South Africa, that came up a lot. It was really around how people manipulated systems in order for themselves and their friends and families to benefit. So those systems need to be strong in order to prevent manipulation. But coming back to what you said before, people need to be strong enough to resist.
Yeah, it all ties together, I can imagine. And then
that's where like education comes in, right? I would guess.
I think, education, not necessarily in the traditional sense of the word either, but perhaps more of an awareness of how things work. And
public consciousness, because education also is very susceptible to being manipulated into.
Yes, it is. It is, without a doubt. So, it's more along the lines of just being a responsible citizen, I guess, over and above everything else.
I think that's one of the key issues in a democracy is not like through the institutions, but having the culture inform the newer generations about what you should look out for in an institution, how to know if they're going wrong, and how you can affect them, right? Because I imagine one big thing for you is how do people interact with these institutions? Can they affect it? Should people be able to affect these institutions?
It is important for whoever is in these institutions to have a common vision. And if there isn't that common vision of whatever you want to do, social science, it makes a difference. If you don't have that common vision, things can go very wrong. So you have to have some kind of guiding star that you can look at when things start to go wrong within your institution, when you are sensing cronyism or corruption or bullying, for that matter. You have to keep saying, does this align with the values of the Constitution, but actually quite simply the values of the institution itself. And you cannot really have any form of governance without it being value-based, in my view. But maybe we're looking at it from a very Western perspective in some ways. But at the same time, we have very strong African values that speak to this as well. And the one is Ubuntu. So I am because you are, and you are because I am. So, we are interconnected, interrelated. And so working in your own interest is not always working in the interests of the community that you serve. So that those kinds of things can inform how you see things and how you see things going.
And it sounds like you're touching on something cultural, where there is understanding in certain cultures, communities, that this is what our value system looks like. This is why we do things the way that we do. We all share this insight. But then why do so many countries struggle to translate that into good governance? Why is there still these, from your research, what are the biggest barriers that you've seen that make it so hard?
I think that ideology has a lot to do with it. So, the ideological bent of your society. So you get your sort of hyper-liberal societies where, private interests are really outweighing absolutely everything else. And then you get your more, let's say, social welfare or socialist type societies where people are aware of the fact that poverty and inequality are a blight on society, and therefore that measures need to be taken to protect the vulnerable. So, you get different kinds of overriding. It sounds strange, but you do get different kinds of overriding ideologies within states, and that would then determine how morality and values are constructed.
No, that makes sense. And in your research, you mentioned earlier that you look into gender equality and human rights. So how does that fit into this larger conversation about strong institutions and good governance?
Well, if you are in an institution that is infringing anybody's rights, or allowing those rights to be infringed by, for example, not dealing with sexual abuse and sexual harassment, then it's an institution that is not serving its purpose in my view. So if women are being alienated within that context, let's look at institutions more broadly. If women are being oppressed within any kind of structure, then there's something severely wrong with it, because of the fact that disempowered women lead to disempowered societies. So, there must be some way of people beginning to understand that women's empowerment is good for us.
Yeah, and then in the broader context of international institutions where cultural norms or beliefs might be very different, some things might be more permissive than others, and then, there's a morality, ethical question about how much do you infringe on it, or do you just back down and you treat things based on the local context? Like, how do you balance that when it comes to international institutions?
It's the most difficult part of everything that I do is in the international space within multilateralism. Because Women 20, for instance, is consensus-based. So we have 19 countries, the European Union and the African Union, all in one space. And there are a lot of differences to navigate in these spaces. And that's why I was talking about societal ideology or state ideologies, because you can see it coming through in the negotiations. The amazing thing for me is that for 10 years now, Women 20 has reached consensus on a communique and released that communique with recommendations to the leaders annually. So despite all of the differences that we have, we can come to an agreement about some of the fundamental issues. And this is really, to me, quite miraculous, because it shows you that there is something there. There's a core that matters to everybody. So we started off, for example, no, we can only look at economic issues. So you must give women more jobs. Okay. So everybody can kind of stomach the fact that you must give women more jobs. Then it was a matter of women in leadership. So that was pushing it a little bit further. And so we've gone, and now we're in a situation where we're even looking at gender-based violence and femicide as an economic issue. And that was resisted for many years, saying gender-based violence against women has nothing to do with the economy. But if you are abusing women, they become unproductive. If you want to put it in economic terms, they become unproductive and your economy loses. So those kinds of things have been evolving over time, and we're finding one another, but it's not an easy process. It takes a lot of hard work. And you have to put aside some of your own personal views to work for what one could probably call the international common good. So, if one of the countries doesn't want to hear the terms, sexual health and reproductive rights, then you have to find some other way of expressing it.
For sure. And it sounds like there's a more holistic approach as well. It's not seeing issues in a silo, but more like this thing leads to this thing, and these two issues are connected. So we can tackle one to fix the other almost. So as head of the delegation for W20 South Africa this year, what priorities are you bringing to the global table?
Some of the more unique priorities, I suppose. There was a little bit of a pushback around the South African presidency's priorities. So they were sort of, solidarity, equality, and sustainability. But South Africa stood its ground in the G20 space. And so we are encompassing a lot of that in the work that we do as Women 20. So we're looking at issues of climate justice, the environment, and sustainability. So we're specifically looking at that issue and the way in which climate change and environmental degradation affect women. But not only the vulnerability of women, but also the way in which women can reshape the agenda around these issues. We're also looking at the digital divide and tech facilitated gender-based violence. The care economy, most of women's time is spent caring for others. I don't even think that's a generalization. I think it applies in every country in the world. And so, women spend a lot of their time caring, and how can we calculate this in terms of the economic participation that is happening, the contributions towards the economy that are invisible, that are not being recognized. We're also looking at gender-based violence and femicide as a scourge, not only in South Africa, but South Africa and Brazil, for instance, have serious problems with that. And entrepreneurship and financial inclusion, which is one of the more traditional areas. And then we're also looking at health equity for women and girls.
You've got a full agenda there. That's very exciting. And do you see these topics kind of interacting with each other as well as you're researching and proposing things, right?
Yeah, without a doubt. There are a lot of intersections. The care economy is an example. So, for instance, because women are overburdened with responsibilities of care, they're less likely to become entrepreneurs. And then when women become financially vulnerable as a result of the fact that they do not have employment, they're more vulnerable to abuse in the home, because interpartner violence is the most prevalent kind of violence, not only in South Africa, but almost everywhere in the world. So financially vulnerable women are going to be more vulnerable to abuse within the home in particular. So all of those things kind of fit together and create a picture of, the intersections that occur, as well as the way in which these things influence women differently. So it's race, class, gender, all of those kinds of things that work together to determine a woman's status in society.
Like that intersectionality of it all. And I guess to close off this episode, if you could leave our audience with one action to help strengthen, whether it is institutions, democracy, social justice in general, what would it be?
I think it's to be aware of your position in society, your own privilege, and your own failures. And if we become more self-aware, we become more responsive to others. And I think that's something that is probably a difficult lesson to learn. But in doing that, in becoming more self-aware, you're able to see how you're interacting within spaces, within communities, institutions, and societies that might be harmful to others.
Well, we're going to stay on for a bit longer, talking a bit more about strong institutions, policy and research, and making them happen. But thank you so much, Professor Narnia, for joining us. You can check out the blog at tangeliclife.org, and we'll catch you guys on the next one. Thank you.
Let's talk power, let's talk change. From rural lights to brighter days. Equity rising, voices strong. We're building tomorrow where we all belong. Tangelic Talks, energy, equity, pride. Empowering the world, side by side. A spark becomes a fire, a vision that's true. Together we rise, it starts with you.